Hello there, everybody. So I watched the new Rambo movie, and then I went on the internet and I was having a look at some of the big channels on YouTube to see what their takes were on it, and I was a bit disappointed because none of them seemed to want to get into the politics of it. Meanwhile, in the mainstream media, like the Guardian, the New York Times, and whatnot, they were all butchering Stallone's new Rambo film precisely because of its politics. And I think there's an argument to be made to say we're going to look at a film just because, just on its own merits, just as a film. But I think when there's so much discussion about the politics of it, that's a bit of a cookout. And so I thought I'd just do my own video where I could take a deep dive into the politics of it, and that it represents so much about the cultural age. Because another thing about the Rambo movies is that it's convenient for all these fellas with these massive movie review YouTube channels to sort of just focus on the movie and the mechanics of the movie in and of itself, and say that they're not going to get bogged down in any politics relating to it, which they do all the time. But the fact is that it is there and it does need to be discussed. And in terms of Rambo, the new one, and all of the other ones, politics was there. It wasn't just about some nutter blowing shit up as what they want to see. It was, First Blood was the reaction against the American soldiers coming back and being called baby killers, and that the American military was really out of fashion. The second movie was that they needed the American military. It's Reagan. America's found its confidence again, and it's that they're looking for who's to blame for the mess of Vietnam in the 1970s, and they put it down to these NGOs rather than the State Department or the Council of Foreign Relations or these shady organisations who are much more involved in the American government. They put it down to sort of mercenaries and NGOs. That's who's to blame. And then by the time you get to Rambo 3, they've gone sort of full neocon, or he's actually on the side with the CIA assets of the time, fighting against the Russians, and it's a sort of justification for having at some point a naval an army base to the south of Russia. So there's really a lot to dig into in terms of politics with the Rambo movies, which people often write off. They've always reflected the times that they're in. Rambo 4 is a bit of an exception to that, and I think it should have ended at Rambo 3. Rambo 4 in Burma, which I've done an article about, called Rambo and the Eternal White Woman, which I'll link to below. That's sort of the phenomenon, I think, of the rise of the liberal, the liberal guilt-tripped white. But then we get, so where we are now is this is hopefully going to be the last one, and it doesn't really sit well within the Rambo canon, just for the simple fact is Stallone's too old, and it looks kind of ridiculous. He pops these pills, and I don't know if that's because he has to keep a lid on his aggression. He's going to blow a gasket and go full bandana and bow on everybody, or if it's just because he's like ancient and can barely walk. I wasn't too sure which way that went. But the story itself, which people like the Guardian have said it's this racist Trumpian fantasy, and there's a lot of sort of liberal tears being shed about it. So that the movie itself is that Rambo's now kind of just sitting on his porch and riding his horse in Arizona and living a bit of a chilled out life, and he's moved in a Mexican who's a woman who's a cleaner, and then there's a girl, I don't know what she is, like her niece or something, it doesn't matter, she's just there to give somebody Rambo something to care about. So, of course, she gallivants off to Mexico, which is depicted in the movie as being a complete and utter shithole. And against Rambo's advice, she gets sold into a sex slave trade. She's hooked on heroin, used as a prostitute. And, Rambo's, not very happy about it. And so he goes down to get her back, gets himself into a bit of trouble, but then eventually, of course, the serrated knife comes out and people start getting gutted and beheaded, having their faces smashed in with a hammer. It's absolutely brutal once it gets going. But it speaks to something in the general culture of the moment, which the liberals at the Goldbergs at the New York Times and the Guardian would rather it wasn't discussed whatsoever. And I mean, leaving aside Stallone's ethnic background, he's the avatar of the sort of masculine white man, and this is a new kind of movie which we're seeing more and more. I can think of Logan. There's Taken, which a lot of people are comparing the new Rambo to Taken. It's almost the same storyline. And then you've got No Country for Old Men, and all of these movies are sort of addressing the issue of the white alpha getting on in years and struggling to cope with the rising tide of colour around them. And so this is what a lot of these lads on YouTube don't seem to want to get into with the storyline. It's where it's as if the old lion is struggling to sort of maintain his grip on his territory, and the hyenas are moving in and taking what's his. And this is a recurring theme that we're starting to see now. And it's definitely the case in the new Rambo movie, where what he actually explains to the girl, like, what the world is a disgusting, brutal and barbaric place, and you belong here on the ranch with me where you're safe. Totally ignored, and it turns out that he was right. So it's a fundamentally illiberal view of the world, not a very popular one at all. And then he puts that to practice as well. So then not only is he proven correct, but he even has his own personal philosophy, which is to say, which amounts to might makes right. So the hyenas and all of these savages south of the border would, or in the case of Taken, it would be these North African sex trade gangs abducting European white girls, which is something close to my heart. I'm not as well clued up on the Mexican situation. I'm not American, but again, it does kind of, the rage that Rambo feels is something which a lot of white men can kind of, which resonates with a lot of white men across the West. And it's this thing where you can see the rising tide of colour, and that you feel that something should be done about it. The government isn't responding to it. And Rambo's response to this is to revert to a sort of might makes right argument. And he even has this kind of nihilistic and quite disturbing philosophy of his own, which is that in order to sort of beat the chaos of what this case was, is the second world is Mexico, Rambo thinks he has to be even more barbaric than what they are. And that's the point that he sets about proving in Last Blood. So they are, I mean, the Mexican gangs themselves are pretty bloody awful, and Rambo goes one better on them. So that there's two brothers who are controlling the drugs, and it's a cartel. And so Rambo sneaks into one of where he lives, this big apartment complex, murders all of his bodyguards with a hammer and his knife, and then he strings him up on his bed and beheads him, so that when his brother comes in, he actually finds him beheaded. He sees that his brother has been beheaded, and this sends the brother nuts, and he goes up with all of his crew to take out Rambo, and then Rambo kills all of them in various ways. Essentially, Rambo wages guerrilla warfare on this Mexican cartel, which they don't really know how to deal with. I would have much preferred to see Stallone doing this 30 years ago, but there we are. But it still speaks to the zeitgeist. And in the end, Rambo explains that to the bloke, the Mexican kingpin, that really, you don't know what fear and death is. You don't know what horror is. And then he cuts out his heart and throws his heart on the floor. So it's this really brutal take on the world, which it's actually difficult to fault. You know, despite the bit of that Rambo's been a bit cooked. But to be fair with the Mexican girl, Rambo has never had any kind of romantic entanglement since the second film, and she was a Vietnamese and she got riddled with bullets, and that's when he blew up the Vietnamese captain straight after. And I find this new trend in Hollywood movies quite interesting, and also the liberal reaction to it, which is this sort of the last days of the white man, the white alpha clinging on to what he's got, and he's still got it. When he kicks, he can still kick hard, but it's also absolutely despised by the liberal press because they know what's being meddled about with here. Another thing that you'll notice about this new breed of movie is that it's always just a single white man, and it isn't. So the obvious response to something like what Rambo's facing here would be to have some sort of militia or a collective response to enforce the border, which hasn't been done, and so they would then really trigger the alarm systems, because what you can have one alpha renegade white man popping up in a movie from time to time. We still get away with that, it would seem. But what's absolutely off the table is the idea of having a collective militia or political movement. And then, of course, you get that this is simply what the Guardian call a Trumpian fantasy, which is, of course, focused squarely on the southern border and the fact that there should have been a wall there by now. Trump hasn't built it. This could be, I mean, I think this movie could be seen as propaganda for Trump going into 2020. And again, it speaks to what his base wants and what they're thinking, but it is deeply politically incorrect. I mean, as far it is the worst Rambo movie, I think it would have been fine if it was just a straightforward Sylvester Stallone sort of revenge movie. An old guy on a farm likes this young girl. She's been abducted by scumbags and a Mexican cartel, and then he wages war upon them. That would have been a fine standalone movie. Didn't have to have the Rambo tag, but here we are. If anything, it is just that continuing theme of Rambo reflecting the zeitgeist of the times. So I mean, I'd give it a watch. I'd definitely give it a watch, but with that in mind, because what the sort of the soy boy types are, it's just this sort of Texas Chainsaw Rambo, especially the last half hour or so. In actual fact, the movie itself has some good themes to wrap your hand around, and it's not very often you're going to see a movie as illiberal as this, to the point where totally the opposite message of like the establishment, where it is the world outside of your boundaries, outside of the domain of the white man. The world is an absolutely savage and barbaric place that can only be controlled with brute force and horror and gore. And then you can then you've earned the right to sort of sit on your ranch and within your own country, but you don't get it all for free. You don't get it. You can't just not have borders and not actually impose your will on these hyenas and expect to survive very long. So in that way, it's a very I can see why it triggered a lot of people. So I do hope this is the last one in the series. So all right, there you go. I'll catch you later, folks.